Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. Today's episode with Depanneur, the superb microhistory of a macro topic, Bigfoot. Where does he come from? Where does he go? And is Cotton Eye Joe related to him at all? The world has questions, but our guest today has answers. Please enjoy the episode and be sure to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and help support us on Patreon. A small and sad note about the audio today. The last about 10 to 15 minutes of the podcast was a little sound warped. Unfortunately, there was an echo picked up by the microphone that was not fixable in terms of audio editing, and we ran out of time to re-record that little bit. So rather than leave it out, I have chosen to leave it in, but if you find it unbearable, you might want to skip towards the end of the podcast. I hope you still enjoy the episode.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. Today, we are lucky to be joined by depanneur, who was flaired on Ask Historians as Pre-Norman Ireland and European Fascism until 1945. He's better known to his friends and family as Pat Reeb, and he's a master's student at the National University of Ireland, Galway, in medieval studies. Today, we'll be discussing one of the most important and understudied realms of history, a notorious and often overlooked field. That's right, we're talking about Bigfoot. Bigfoot as a cultural phenomenon, and Bigfoot as Bigfoot. Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast, Pat.
Hey, how's it going? I'm pleased to talk to you tonight.
Very pleased to have you here. So let's begin where we usually do. What got you interested in history?
What got me interested in history? I was one of those kids who was like super into dinosaurs, and I wanted to be like a paleontologist, but I suck at math. So I just like settled for people history.
And that just drew you from people history instead of doing paleontology?
That's the beginning of my odyssey to doing grad school in Ireland about like medieval Irish history.
Where did you come from before you started doing Irish history in Ireland?
I was at the University of Concordia in Montreal, and I also kind of specialized in medieval history, but like there was one medievalist in the history department and she like didn't do what I did. So I kind of like wandered on my own, like guidelessly while I did my undergrad thesis.
And your undergrad thesis just naturally led you to all sorts of interest in cultural phenomenon?
Yeah, like Bigfoot, exactly.
How's it different from doing traditional history, like military history, diplomatic history? Why would you focus on the cultural phenomenon?
I always like studying weird stuff in history because I find like these weird cultural phenomena are like this cool starting point for exploring how human culture changes over time. If you study, for example, Bigfoot or people believing in the Loch Ness Monster and stuff, eventually you'll get to a point where you're not studying it just for its own sake. Like I'm not actually reading about like, oh, Bigfoot was this 8-foot tall monster covered in hair and weighs 600 pounds. Like you're reading what people actually think about these things. You approach it as you would any other kind of historical subject. In doing so, you get to these bigger questions. I mean, like you have a lot less material to work with. You really don't know that much about what went on. So you kind of have to be more methodologically creative to be able to study these kinds of things, which is why I'm also interested in like the history of the supernatural. The subject of this podcast, I suppose, kind of falls into, because you have to like kind of construct your own methodology drawing from other disciplines.
I'm just out of curiosity, how do you do that? How do you construct a methodology to study something supernatural?
That's a hard question. I guess it depends on like the period you're looking at. Mm-hmm. So like for this kind of subject, like if we're talking about people believing in Bigfoot, you look at how folklorists deal with oral histories that they collect. And the primary sources I use for like the original research for this kind of thing, I was actually reading on like internet forums, Bigfoot internet forums as like a body of primary sources. And there's a lot of literature out there about how you can use these kinds of sources as like a body of evidence as any other historian would in like an archive.
So just to draw on that, like how do you study cultural phenomena of things that don't leave any records? Things that like aren't real. I've been told Bigfoot is real.
See, this is something that's like kind of contentious because you're not really supposed to pass judgment over whether you think it's bullshit or not. You're like studying more the kind of like cultural phenomena, like people actually believing in it and what that has to say about the culture in which they live and like the sort of historical phenomena that are like shaping their cultural worldview.
So let's talk about the cultural phenomenon that is Bigfoot. One is big, or we should start with like, who is Bigfoot? Where does he come from? What's the story with him?
So there's a lot of conflicting opinions in the Bigfoot community. There's an entire community of people who believe in Bigfoot. There's actually some like decent scholarly works that I consulted before, doing this podcast about like people who believe in Bigfoot. One of them is by a folklorist called Brian Regal, and it's called like Searching for Sasquatch. And it's like less about like Bigfoot itself than the sort of like interaction between these like people who go out and like scream at trees at night and like scientists who kind of believed in Bigfoot, which will probably like come up later on during the podcast. He has this rundown of the people who believe in Bigfoot, like what do they think? And 80% of them believe that Bigfoot is like a flesh and blood creature that like tramps around the North American wilderness. And then you also have 10% who believe Bigfoot is an alien who comes from extraterrestrial crafts. For some reason, I don't know why. He doesn't have clothes or anything. He just walks around the wilderness naked. And then there's another 10%, and this will probably also come back around later in the podcast, who believe that Bigfoot is an interdimensional being. And that the reason why, whenever people take pictures of him, he's blurry, it's because he's an interdimensional being and he's phasing in and out of existence. So the dominant, yeah, I know this is gonna be a wild podcast. It's gonna be unlike anything you've ever sat through before. So the dominant position for a lot of people, it was first articulated by an American anthropologist, paleoanthropologist named Grover Krantz in the 1960s or 70s. Anyways, and it was his opinion that Bigfoot was a relict population of this giant orangutan that lived in Southeast Asia. I don't know when, like a long time ago, called Gigantopithecus, which like some Dutch anthropologist discovered when he was buying medicine at like a Chinese apothecary in like 1930. And he saw that there's these like giant monkey teeth on a counter somewhere.
I just want to start with like the most basic question of
okay.
Can you describe what Bigfoot looks like? Can you describe like who he is for people that might not actually be aware of Bigfoot?
Okay, yeah, I'm getting ahead of myself here. I just assume everybody knows all the things about Bigfoot. He's said to be, or he or she, it's like a species, is said to stand between 7 and 9 feet tall and weigh between 600 and 800 pounds. And it is a human-like ape creature that's it. That's the basic rundown. And it lives in the wilderness, and there's all kinds of weird theories that people have come up with about like what it eats, like where it sleeps at night. I'm not going to go into that, but the basic gist of it is that Bigfoot is this like creature that lives in the woods apparently, and people sometimes catch it on camera, but never like in full picture.
When was Bigfoot first reported?
Okay, so we're going on the other side of the globe right now. Actually, no, we'll start off with like the really, really far back, the cultural prerequisite to Bigfoot. There's this anthropologist called Gregory Forth who he argues in this one essay that like basically every single human culture on the planet has this kind of half human, humanoid creature. And his reasoning why this is like such a widespread phenomenon is that it's a way for people to kind of think about what it means to actually be human. So it appears in like folklore across the planet. Like every conceivable culture has something that kind of sounds like Bigfoot. The ancestor of the cultural image of Bigfoot comes from Europe, actually. And it's the medieval wild man. So basically, there's this one historian called Richard Bernheimer who wrote this huge book about the wild man in European not mythology, but literature. And he argued that it's an entirely literary figure. And because of medieval theology, people couldn't really conceive of something like the missing link, which is what people think Bigfoot usually is, because they don't really understand Darwinian evolutionary theory. So for medieval people, the wild man is just a human. It's just a guy who's removed from culture, and he's just forgotten how to wear clothes and stuff, and for some reason has just become like really hairy and supernaturally strong. And actually, you know what? Let's come all the way around. He's also a figure in medieval Irish literature, One of the most famous, like, old Irish literary texts is called Bulla Huvna, and it's about a guy who becomes a wild man. Who, yeah, he's like a king who's cursed by some saint to like turn into a insane bird person and fly around in the wilderness, and then he gets like stabbed by some guy in the chest. But it completely fits the mold of like the wild man sort of narrative. This like understanding of that there can be these sort of figures who like live out in the woods, peaceful coexistence with nature. They're like the antithesis of civilization, gets filtered down into the 19th century because, you know, when Europeans start exploring the world and stuff, they impose that understanding on the sort of new peoples that they see in like North Americans. And also at the same time, this sort of figure gets imposed on our understanding of our own past. You know, in the 19th century, you have these depictions of cavemen and stuff. That is like just a classic depiction of like the medieval wild man. And that totally informs how people think about animals like Bigfoot in the early 20th century. The other side of the coin, because it isn't just European, it's also kind of draws on European understandings of indigenous, I don't want to say folklore, but like narratives in the Pacific Northwest, because they also have these kind of similar figures. But by the time that Europeans are in contact with these ideas, they're in a kind of post-Enlightenment mindset. And we still have this today. We have this pure divide between like natural and supernatural. It's inconceivable for us that like the natural and supernatural can meld together, and which for a lot of cultures just isn't the case. And that's what happens when Europeans hear about Sasquatch in the Pacific Northwest for the first time, which is this cultural figure among the Coast Salish people. And that's like the actual origin figure of Bigfoot. It's this sort of Native American figure in their cultural narratives that's a giant that lives in the woods. But it's not like the only one. There's this one article that I read that's like there's like 8 different kinds of Bigfoot in their cultural narratives, and all the other ones are just like unintelligible to Europeans because they're like dwarves or like man-eating ogres and stuff like that. And the Sasquatch one kind of stuck against the wall because it's the only one that conformed to like European post-Enlightenment biological understandings of the world.
Okay, so what you're saying is that there's this old European idea of the wild man, and he gets carried through European understandings when they go to the New World, and they begin to meet up with sort of Native American views of the Sasquatch.
Yeah.
What I actually didn't even realize the Sasquatch and Bigfoot were 2 different things. I thought they were just the same sort of thing.
Oh, no, they are absolutely the same thing. But Sasquatch, like the Aboriginal Coast Salish word for like that creature.
But it gets mixed up with this old idea of the wild man.
Yeah, Bigfoot is kind of the like syncretic figure between the two.
It's almost like a mix of the 2 different worldviews coming together in a sense and melding.
Yeah, it is almost, but it's like kind of one-sided because it's like entirely dictated by how Europeans and like their descendants understand how the world works. I'll give the citation for this article later. I can't like pull it off the top of my head right now. But this author talks about a multitude of different kinds of Sasquatch that Coast Salish people believe in. And the Europeans just took nothing from that because like it just could not conform to their worldview.
That's fascinating. So where does the Bigfoot narrative, I guess in the modern day, come from? Does it come from when we had the invention of photography, or when does the real hysteria kick off?
So this actually starts in the Himalayas because, I mean, as early as like the 1920s, there had been Europeans who had been working in indigenous communities in the Pacific Northwest who were talking about these sort of cultural narratives, and everyone just kind of brushed it off like, they're just talking about some bullshit. But when Europeans start taking it seriously, it's when, okay, so we're going to the Himalayas right now. And British colonial officials since like the 19th century had been kind of mentioning here and there that the like Tibetan and Nepalese and Sherpa people kind of believed in these like wild men figures who live up in the mountains, and like nobody really took it seriously. But when it takes off is when there was like some geological expedition around Mount Everest.
Mm-hmm.
And the leader of the expedition reported to have seen these giant ape creatures traipsing around the mountain valleys by himself. And his Sherpa guide told him like the name, and I can't really recall what the name was.
Mm-hmm.
So he reports this to a journalist who wrote for the Calcutta Statesman back down in British India. And this guy had like absolutely no understanding of like the Nepalese language. So he just like thumbed through some dictionary. How can I make this intelligible for English people who don't care about Indians? And like he just settled on the abominable snowman. You know, even in like 1955, there's like some Indian academic who is like, if you actually properly translate the term, it just means like bear. But it was too late for that. It caught off. He reports this and they publish the paper. And people go fucking ape shit. Because yeah, the Himalayas were like the ultimate expression of European Orientalism. They thought like monks were fucking meditating and like, you know, doing levitation and stuff. And there's like hidden cities and valleys. So this is like totally logically acceptable for white people to believe in. So then later on, I mean, it kind of died down for a while. And it's only really in the 1950s that it catches over again when Eric Shipton, he was trying to climb Mount Everest. And in 1951, he was the first person to take pictures of a Yeti footprint around Mount Everest. So people were already like fucking crazy for the abominable snowman. And this just like sparks the flame and people go even crazier. So the Daily Mail, they outfitted an expedition to find the Yeti. And they didn't find it. They just found like poop, like belonging to some animal. And they came back with nothing. But there were like
Daily Mail was a tabloid in the 1950s and it remains a tabloid today.
Yeah, no, they haven't improved their journalistic integrity that much since 1951. So like, there are these private people from like all around the world who want to find Bigfoot, or no, not Bigfoot yet. They want to find the abominable snowman in the Himalayas. So there's this one British citizen named Peter Byrne, I think, and in the 1950s, he organized some expedition to go there and find the abominable snowman. The thing with all these expeditions is that they're not scientific in any way. They're just like a bunch of rich dudes funding like some Sherpas to carry all their shit while they like go take pictures of like animals over the horizon. So it gets weirder than this, okay? So Peter Byrne's expedition, they noticed that the wolves in the Himalayas would run away from white men, but they would not hesitate to approach the native Himalayans. So they figured that if they dressed themselves in Nepalese garb and painted their faces brown, that they would have some chance of seeing the abominable snowman because it wouldn't be afraid of them.
So they got dressed up in blackface because they assumed the abominable snowman would.
Yeah, he was a fan of ragtime.
Because they assumed the abominable snowman would approach a Nepalese person, but not a European.
Yeah, but not white people. No. Anyways, there's also people from Japan who come. There's like Americans and stuff. And you have to consider that at the time, we're thinking of the big picture here. Communist China had just invaded and annexed Tibet in like 1950.
Mm-hmm.
So there was like, these are all like private expeditions to go find the abominable snowman. But they were probably funded by the United States and United Kingdom to basically spy on the communist Chinese in Tibet. There's one
the US and UK government were funding these expeditions.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because there's the most famous American expedition was funded by a rich, eccentric Texas oil man named Tom Slick, who was also a old cartoon character's name. And Tom Slick's expedition was consulted by a Harvard anthropologist by the name of Carlton Kuhn, who had been an OSS operative in North Africa during the Second World War. And the best thing about this story is that the characters are so like fucking weird and colorful. So Carlton Kuhn, he was like, the Navy rejected him during the Second World War because he was obese. So like, he used his family connections to get the OSS, which is like the predecessor to the CIA, to hire him as like a spy in North Africa, and he really didn't do anything. But he had a personal interest in Tom Slick finding the abominable snowman because he was really racist. And he wanted to find the abominable snowman to prove his personal theory that it was actually like an early human ancestor. And that like if they could find that, and this guy was an anthropologist at Harvard, right? But he wasn't like Franz Boas kind where you like ask them about their folklore and stuff. He was like the dude who like show up in a village with like calipers and measure their scalps. And like he wanted to prove that all human races they're not descended from a common origin. And that like if they found the abominable snowman, it must be like a relict population of one of those non-white people racial ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
So he was a consultant for the Tom Slick expedition, and he had all of these CIA contacts, I suppose. Another one of the sort of quote unquote scientific consultants for Tom Slick's expedition also had CIA contacts as well. He also served for the OSS during the Second World War. These things were like entirely funded by the US government. And Brian Regal, he actually tried to get, I mentioned his book before. He mentions that he actually used the Freedom of Information Act to try and get documentation about the Yeti and abominable snowman for his book. And his requests were denied because I don't have the wording in front of me right now, but because it was like a matter of national security. So yeah, they're just like totally spying on the Chinese. And at the time, people knew that because the Soviets organized their own abominable snowman expedition in 1958. And this is a whole other thing because they wanted to find the abominable snowman because they thought that if they did, it would prove that Marx's theory of dialectical materialism was an actual science. Because the Russians' understanding of like Bigfoot and stuff is like completely different than like what Americans think of it. So Americans think that Bigfoot and the Yeti are giant apes, basically. Mm-hmm. But the Russians believe that the Yeti and Bigfoot, and they have their own version called like the Almasty, are more like humans, just like hairy humans that wear clothes and stuff. They have language. Mm-hmm. And it's basically because, so Friedrich Engels, for those of you who don't know, was like the Danny Glover to Marx's Mel Gibson. He wrote an essay on his own called the Role of Labor in the Evolution from Ape to Man. And he argued that humans became humans, like sapient humans, differentiated from other animals because of our discovery of labor. And that like human cognition developed because we were making tools and throwing spears at stuff, which is actually kind of correct. Apparently, he was like vindicated later on. But the Soviets took that as though if they find the Bigfoot and it is like a human, then Engels would be vindicated and everything that came out of he thought would be like total scientific fact. So like if they found the abominable snowman and it was this unevolved human that just like never developed labor, then Marxism would just be actual science now and you have to read it in science books. But they never got that.
Okay, so to summarize, basically, the abominable snowman was seen.
Yeah, this is how it starts. Yeah, people like are talking about this around the world now. It's a cultural phenomena, and not too shortly after, there are reports in 1955.
No, wait.
Yeah, I know.
Before you jump over there, I just want to do a quick summary.
Okay.
Abominable snowman shows up in the 1920s. It reappeared in the 1950s and is used by the Soviets in order to prove communism is scientific fact.
Yeah.
It's used by the Americans and the British as a way to spy on the Chinese.
Yeah. Oh, not just that, though. Okay. So last thing about the abominable snowman before we move over to actual Bigfoot is that in 1960, Eric Shipton, who you may or may not know was the first man to summit Mount Everest, mounted his own kind of expedition. And he was like, yeah, total bullshit. But he was funded by the CIA, or not the CIA, by the US military, actually, because they were flying U-2 spy planes out of Pakistan to spy on Soviet military installations. And they wanted to know about how they would have to train their spy plane pilots to survive if they got shot down over the Himalayas. So after Shipton is like, yeah, this is like total bullshit. Don't believe in this anymore. People just lose interest for like 10 years.
So you have all this mix up of CIA spy money, people spying on each other, and the Soviets trying to prove communism is scientific fact.
Yeah.
When
totally.
Does the abominable snowman make the giant leap across the Pacific into the Americas?
So that happens in Okay, so 1958. Okay,
Mhm.
actually no. Let's start a bit before that. This is just in 1958. It like comes back into the public consciousness. So even before that, there was this one dude in these two dudes in Canada who will come back into the bigger picture later on. One of them was this one guy called René Dahinden, who was some like Swiss guy who had like the most miserable life of anyone who's ever moved to Canada. He was like some woman's bastard child that she sent to an orphanage and then was worked on a farm until he like moved to Canada and looked for Bigfoot. And then his wife left him because he was looking for Bigfoot too often. Yeah, it's just like really fucking sad. He's in a Kokanee beer commercial. And like they're just using him as like a prop to sell beer in like the 1990s. But anyways, so he comes to Canada and he hears about all this abominable snowman shit. And he's like, well, this sounds really interesting. I wish I could go there and like hunt for the Yeti on my own. And at the farm that he was working on in Alberta, the farm owner was like, well, you don't have to go very far because here in Canada, we got our own abominable snowman that we call the Sasquatch. So he goes around collecting stories with a journalist who thought it was total bullshit, but like he could sell his newspaper articles by using it because people just like bought this up, called John Green. So they went around, and this is at like the height of not at the height, but it's like in the public consciousness, right? And there's like people coming out who are like, oh, and why was a prospector back in 1924? And they're like telling their stories about like, there's this one guy called Albert Ostman who John Green and René Dahinden interviewed. And he said that back in 1924, he was prospecting in British Columbia, and he was kidnapped by a family of Bigfoot who like kept him in some canyon, and they like weaved grass into like textiles to wear. And he escaped by making the male eat his snuff. And yeah, there's like a bunch of these stories from like the 1950s where it's like these guys come out and like, yeah, well, back in the 1920s, you know, these apes attacked me in my cottage and I shot one of them and it fell off of a cliff. So it's like kind of on the back burner right now in the major news articles. But Tom Slick, the guy from before, he organized a expedition to Northern California because in 1958 there were a bunch of loggers in Bluff, I think, yeah, it's California, who apparently found a bunch of big footprints and they called it Bigfoot. And that's where the name comes from. Tom Slick expedition, again, finds nothing, but they were like totally kitted out. They had like helicopters and stuff. They were like the bad guys in Jurassic Park 2. Actually, no, they found more poop and hair, but apparently they did like DNA testing later on, and that poop and that hair came from moose. And mooses don't live in Northern California, so like someone obviously planted it for them to find. And the weirdest part about all this Bigfoot stuff is that people will always come out and they'll be like, yeah, I was the one that hoaxed it. But you can't be sure if you can trust what they have to say because so many of these people will just, yeah, I hoaxed it. Now buy my book.
Are you aware of the fact that there is a Bigfoot museum in Portland, Maine?
In Portland, Maine?
It's called the Museum of Cryptozoology, and the founder of the museum says he's a skeptic, but a skeptic willing to believe. And if you ask him about Bigfoot, he will go on for an hour.
I mean, like, that sounds like a great afternoon to me.
This is so ridiculous.
Yeah, so, okay, and then at this time, after Tom Slick finds nothing and you have these, like, footprints at Bluff Creek, it becomes this total, like, media circus. Bigfoot becomes this huge figure in pulp novels where he'll, like, steal people's women and, like, run off into the woods. And the man has to like come out bare-chested and like fight Bigfoot with his fists. And it's this total like, you know, masculinity and crisis thing where Bigfoot represents this virile like what the white working class imagines what they could be like, but now that their like position in society is in question, they're like have to think about beating him up and taking their women back. And like actually, yeah, like the racial stuff comes into this because I mentioned before that Harvard anthropologist Carlton Kuhn, he was actually openly segregationist and was using his like anthropological stuff that was like based in Bigfoot to like say that segregation should stay in place. And like, yeah, he like published in like some journal written by an Italian, or no, it was edited by a guy who had been an Italian fascist in the 1920s and 30s. And I can't remember the guy's name, but he had this journal called like Genus. And all these Bigfoot people published papers in it. It was totally unscientific, but it's like the only thing that they could get into. Until, well, we'll get to this later on, this guy called Grover Krantz. He's like an actual scientist that believes in Bigfoot, but that's later on in the story. So there's like a bunch of hoaxes that happen in between, like Bluff Creek and Tom Slick not finding anything. He actually died in a plane crash not too long after that. Very sad. And doing some research in preparation for this podcast, I actually discovered that in the late 1990s, a biopic about Tom Slick was in the works, meant to star one Nicolas Cage, but for some reason was canceled.
Shame on Hollywood.
Total shame. Anyways, so Edmund Hillary totally debunks the Yeti. Tom Slick dies in a plane crash, and his expedition finds nothing. So in like 1967, it comes back again, like herpes. And these two guys by the name of Robert Patterson and Bob Giblin, like just to give you some backstory, Robert Patterson was like a total known con man. Like this story is like so weird, okay? Because admittedly, this is like the really famous Bigfoot video. Like if you ever like look up Bigfoot, this is a still from that video is like the picture that you will see. It's on like 200 covers of like shitty books you can buy on Amazon, I bet. And the video is like kind of cool because I'll go into this later on when I'm talking about it. But Grover Krantz, he's like an actual physical anthropologist. He's like, yeah, it's pretty legit. And his reasons are like pretty convincing. But on the other hand, Robert Patterson, the guy who's going out to film this thing, he's a known con man in Southern California. And he and Bob Gimlin are out in Bluff Creek, where the sort of media circus happened, filming a movie about Bigfoot. When apparently they're like riding their horses around one day in the woods, and they come across a Bigfoot. Yeah, just by coincidence, they just run across one. And it's a female Bigfoot with pendulous breasts that's like walking across the ravine, and like the guy just pulls out his camera and starts filming. And apparently he just looked at them with a look of utter contempt and walked off into the wilderness, and they didn't really follow it because they were afraid that like another Bigfoot would come and eat them. That's true. That's actually true. So this video like goes the pre-internet version of viral, which is not that viral, but like people still were like pretty into it, and there's like all kinds of newspaper articles about it, and it's in magazines and stuff. And Bigfoot is back in the popular consciousness now. And in the next year in Washington, I'm not American, I don't know like where your states are.
You got it.
Yeah, I think I'm good. These two guys I mentioned before, Rene Dahinda and John Green, hear about these extensive Bigfoot tracks that people had found throughout the city near like the town dump. Because I mean, if you're Bigfoot, that's where you get an easy meal, right? Mm-hmm. So they go down there, and there's like 1,000 tracks. It's probably a hoax, okay? But if it was a hoax, it took a lot of effort. And the noticeable thing about this is that one of the feet used to make the tracks was deformed. This is where Grover Krantz comes into the picture, because he is a like paleoanthropologist who studies in like pre-human locomotion or something. And this guy is really fucking weird too. More stuff I found out doing research for this. For 6 months while he was teaching at like the University of Washington State, he wore like prosthetic brow ridges to see like why Homo erectus would have had them early in human history. Yeah, he's like a fucking weird guy. So he goes out there, and he's totally convinced that this is like completely real. He kind of reconstructs what this animal's foot would have looked like, and he's like, yeah, it obviously had its foot broken at some point, and then it reset unnaturally. And if it was fake, they would have, and he was like totally just self-filleting, like took me 3 months to figure out how this animal would have, and somebody who wasn't a physical anthropologist would never have been able to do such a thing. At this point, he goes back to the Patterson-Gimlin film, and he's studying it on a more kind of rigorous way. I really don't know what that entails. Mm-hmm. He noticed that the Patterson-Gimlin film, you can actually see, okay, this happened in 1967, right? It's this animal walking, like quote unquote animal, walking across a ravine. And you can see musculature or something that looks like musculature moving as the animal is walking across the ravine. And keep in mind that this is 1967. The peak of monkey suit technology is the first Planet of the Apes movie, which comes out in 1968. So if it was a costume, it was like a really fucking good costume. Another thing he noticed is that the way that the animal kind of walks in the film is nothing like how an actual human walks. Its knees bend at a 90-degree angle as it walks through the ravine, while like most humans' knees bend at a 70-degree angle. If you were to try this right now, you would look like John Cleese in the Ministry of like Silly Walks sketch. So those are like the only two things that are like pretty legit about this movie. Everything else is, I don't know, just reeks of total scam artistry. So that's how Bigfoot kind of exploded in the popular imagination in North America, especially after the Patterson-Gimlin film comes out. It becomes the template for which people like report to have seen Bigfoot. So there's this website, a Bigfoot organization called the BFRO, which is the Bigfoot Research Organization.
Mm-hmm.
And like, have you ever heard of that show Finding Bigfoot, and they never find Bigfoot?
No, I'm not.
It's a TV show of like these three guys and a girl who go around screaming at trees at night, and like they just don't find Bigfoot. They are the BFRO, and they have a website, and you can go read people's like reports of them seeing Bigfoot, and almost every single one of them that happens after 1967 sounds almost exactly like the Patterson-Gimlin film. Like, well, I actually have some examples here. I forgot about that. Yeah, I mentioned the Albert Ostman case before, which is when the guy got kidnapped by monkeys who wove textiles out of grass. Sounds nothing like Bigfoot after 1967. The other one I kind of mentioned was publicized by a man named Fred Beck in a provocatively titled piece named "I Fought the Ape Men of Mount St. Helens, Washington," in which he claimed that he and 4 other miners were prospecting in Ape Canyon near Mount St. Helens and gradually found evidence of the presence of hairy ape men in the same canyon. And they just shot at it. They shot at one. And they came back at night and just like attacked their cabin until Fred Beck shot one in the fucking face and they ran away. So that's like what people thought Bigfoot was like before the Patterson-Gimlin film comes out. And now, according to the BFRO, like in total contradiction to these stories about like them kidnapping you if you're sleeping in the woods or like trying to like rip your face off, do that. They're like, it's such a harmless creature that a flashlight can scare one away.
Okay, I think you've given us like a pretty comprehensive vision or a story of how Bigfoot became Bigfoot. To bring us to a sort of conclusion, what's next for Bigfoot? Where did we get in the Bigfoot in the modern world?
Why do we have Bigfoot in the modern world?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's because think about the beginning of the podcast, right? People are exploring like the Himalayas and stuff. You have these guys like mapping out these like great wilderness spaces. Like the world is still unknown to people at the beginning of the 20th century, right? Like in our day and age, everything is mapped out. Mm-hmm. If I wanted to, I could go on Google Maps and like use Street View to like look at California. Mm-hmm. So like Bigfoot kind of provides us with this like living mythology, I suppose. Reconstruct like an understanding of the wilderness, a world where wilderness doesn't really exist anymore. Any space can kind of become wilderness, like if humans aren't living there, right? That's like the kind of classic dichotomy. And there's this one American environmental historian called Bill Cronin, and he has this great essay where he kind of deconstructs this view of wilderness about how like wilderness is actually kind of like socially constructed and constructed by like modern state. And Bigfoot is in a way, it's a way for people to construct like a space of wilderness in a world that is totally mapped out and there's no more mystery anymore. And there's some other stuff too, like a lot of people believe in stuff like Bigfoot and other monsters because it's a way to kind of like stick up a middle finger to academia. Mm-hmm. Like these people who are out fucking screaming at trees at night, they know more than the scientists, right? Because the scientists are in their ivory towers and they don't even want to believe in Bigfoot. But these people possess like the real knowledge because they're actually out there. So there's like some like class dynamics at play as well.
I think that brings us almost to like a sad conclusion in a sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, it's really sad.
Okay, well, I think I have to say a huge thank you to us for giving us a huge and comprehensive and immensely entertaining history of Bigfoot, and I'm really excited for our listeners to listen to this episode. But I know, as usual, there will definitely be some follow-up questions, especially follow-up questions about Bigfoot.
Yeah.
So we will have a thread and Ask Historians. If you will please join us there to answer any follow-ups.
All right, ask me anything about Bigfoot, guys. I'm game.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Pat.
Thanks for hosting me.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.